Let me check to make sure my microphone is on. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Bible study, Leviticus chapter 11 today. This chapter is interesting. It's all about the food laws and commands that God gave to the Jewish people. So let's jump in. When did these events happen? These instructions would have been given to the Israelites approximately 1490 BC, 1500 years before Jesus was born. We've got some interesting definitions in this chapter. The first one, cloven hoof or a split hoof. An animal has a cloven hoof when the hoof is divided into two sections. For example, the hoof of a cow is divided in two, whereas the hoof of a horse is not cloven. Chewing the cud is our next definition, our next term to define. Animals that chew cud store food in their stomachs and then later regurgitate it to chew it further. Yum. This process is also known as rumination. Examples of animals that chew the cud include cows, deer, sheep, and giraffes. Fun fact, the Israelites were allowed to eat giraffes. Please let me know if you've ever eaten a giraffe down in the comment section. These animals that have or that chew the cud are known as ruminants. So as we go into our outline section, I've put everything under one heading, and that is laws about food, clean and unclean animals, verses 1 through 47. There's a lot of detail here, so I'll try to be as quick as I can. The Hebrews were allowed to eat any animal that had a cloven hoof and chewed the cud. So animals that did one but not the other were considered unclean, and they could not be eaten. So that would include like camels, hares, pigs, couldn't eat any of those. Everything in the water that had both fins and scales could be used for food. Anything without fins and scales, though, was considered, quote, detestable. God forbid the eating of certain birds. You ready? Here are some examples. Eagles, bearded vultures, black vultures, kites, falcons, ravens, ostriches, nighthawks, seagulls, who would want to eat a seagull anyway, hawks, little owls, cormorants, short-eared owls, barn owls, tawny owls, carrion vultures, storks, herons, hoopoes, and bats. Insects that had wings and that walked on four legs were forbidden from being eaten, but there was an exception. Insects with jointed legs above their feet were allowed to be eaten. For example, locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers. So when John the Baptist in the New Testament is eating locusts, he's not breaking the dietary laws of the Jews. Animals that walked on four paws were unclean to the Israelites. You couldn't eat your dog, you couldn't eat your lion. Moles, rats, mice, great lizards, sand lizards, and chameleons were considered unclean. Not only were the Israelites not to eat these animals and birds and insects, but they were also forbidden from touching their carcasses. If a person touched a carcass of an unclean animal, he or she was considered unclean until the evening. Additionally, anything that an unclean animal's carcass touched, like wood, clothes, skin, a bag, a vessel, would be considered unclean until the evening and had to be washed with water. If the carcass of some unclean animal fell into a earthenware jar or pot, that vessel had to be broken and couldn't be used again. If a clean animal died of natural causes, so it wasn't slaughtered for meat, but it died kind of its own, and it was touched or carried or eaten, those who came into contact with it were unclean until the evening, and they were required to wash their clothes. Animals that crawled on their stomachs, snakes, worms, and insects with, quote, many legs, I suppose that would be like millipedes and centipedes, they were not to be eaten. And caterpillars, the poor caterpillars, who would want to eat the poor caterpillars? These laws were designed to consecrate the people of Israel and to make them a distinct people among the nations. And God commanded them, saying, quote, you shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. So those are the food restrictions that are listed in Leviticus chapter 11. For our application today, I have a little bit of a rant. I can't tell you how many people I've heard, people who are critics of faith, try to discredit Christians for not following the whole Bible because they eat things that are restricted in this list or other places in the Bible, like pigs or shellfish or other unclean animals. Maybe you've heard this before, maybe you haven't, but I'll say that it's popular enough for a former president to have used this argument. Barack Obama, I think it was before he was president, he was on the campaign trail as a senator. he basically criticized Christians for not truly respecting all of the Bible and being consistent with it, because Christians eat shellfish and they wear clothing that's made out of more than one material, which was a restriction that we read about a couple chapters back. But this is a foolish criticism, and it reveals the critics' lack of spiritual and scriptural understanding. These rules that we're reading about were never meant to be applied to modern Christians, nor were they ever imposed in any or on any other nation that was contemporary with the Hebrews, as far as we know. These dietary restrictions were specifically intended for the Israelites within their unique position as God's consecrated people. In fact, the Apostle Peter, in his vision in Acts chapter 10, that's in the New Testament, God makes it clear in that vision that these dietary laws are no longer applicable to modern disciples of Jesus's. Anyone who tries to suggest that Christians are hypocrites because they hold to God's laws as described in the New Testament, but they ignore the laws of Leviticus and therefore they're inconsistent, anyone who says that doesn't understand the context of Leviticus and doesn't understand the story of the Bible. So don't take that and you don't have to think that that's a credible criticism. Typically, people I find that use this argument are just parroting something that they've heard from other people. And these types of criticisms usually aren't coming from a thorough evaluation and deep understanding of the biblical text.